welcome to Driving to the Hoops Basketball Diaries. This is Clint. Today I just was driving around and was thinking about the great centers through each era and how at any given point, at least from 1950 to about the year 2010 or 12, there's been a clear-cut best center in the league pretty much every single year. So I'm not going to go year by year, but we'll start at the beginning and kind of get into the different eras. If you go back to the first great big man, if you want to call him that, he wasn't big by today's standards, 6'10", 240, but he was a beast back in the late 40s and 50s, was a guy named George Mikan. Some of you may have never heard of him, but he put up a lot of great numbers and was one of those guys that was a winner. He won several championships with the Minneapolis Lakers back then. Now, of course, the Los Angeles Lakers. Just a good, big guy. He was, bigger than most of the other players. But he had some skill, kind of had those little hook shots and things like that. Set shots back then, of course. So he was a good one. And he played till, I want to say, 1956. I think he retired in 54, come back in the 56 season. And then and it almost hits parallel with the next top dog, if you want to call him that, at least for a couple of years, was a guy named Bill Russell. You probably have heard of him. He was a great center. Again, a little undersized. He was about 6'9", in the 240 range, but his athleticism was unbelievable, especially for the time. He really had a lot of lift. He was left-handed, but he could jump off 1 or 2 feet. Great defender, great shot blocker, okay scorer. He never even really averaged up over 20 a game in the points department, but he was such a key to his teams that they won 11 championships out of the 13 seasons that he played. Of course, he had a great team around him, but he was the cornerstone of that team, and even was a player coach the last 2 or 3. Let's see, they won it in 68 and 69. I know he was the player coach then, so it's just an amazing basketball mind, and one of the all-time great centers still. But by about his 5th league, there was a young up-and-comer who would, come. I think his rookie season was 1960, was Wilt Chamberlain, and he come in and just immediately started dominating on an individual level. I know Russell was the winner, and I have a whole video on that. But if you're looking at statistics, there's really no more dominant player that's ever played, not just the center position, but any position in basketball, than Wilt Chamberlain. He played with a couple of teams. He was with the Warriors and the Lakers. He's most known for as being a Laker, but his best years were his first 6 or 8 years, where he was that dominant scorer and dominant rebounder. Whereas in the latter parts of his career with the Lakers, he was trying to win more games, and he wasn't so much, not that he wasn't trying to win early, but he was really more team-oriented, I guess is a better way to put it. His last couple of years with the Lakers, he didn't average beastly scoring numbers, although his rebounding was spectacular. But he was pretty much the most dominant center in the league for most of his career, and pretty much until he retired. One key thing about him is, he never fouled out of a game. One year he averaged more minutes per game than there are minutes in a game. Like, he averaged over 48 minutes a game, which is insane. His last season in the NBA, when he was about 35, 36 years old, he set a steal record highest field goal percentage for a single season at an unreal 72% from the field. Now, that's hard to imagine a guy, the starting center in the NBA on a great team, shooting 72% from the field. Granted, he didn't shoot as much at that time, but still, that's crazy. And then, so kind of an overlap there in 1970, their rival of Lou Alcindor. He pretty much, kind of like Wilt, is pretty much as soon as he arrived, he was the best center in the league, and was probably, of all the players on this list, with the exception of maybe Shaq, he was probably the longest dominant center. In other words, from his rookie season until like 1980, he was realistically the best center in the league, most dominant center in the league. Although, I'll get into that in a second, there's a couple of players spiced here and there that were pretty doggone dominant too during Kareem's prime years. So, but Kareem, or Lou Alcindor at the time, later changed his name to Kareem. He come in with the Milwaukee Bucks, and they won a championship his second season. In 1971, he had Oscar Robertson as his main backcourt teammate, and that was actually the only championship Oscar played on. He was really proud of that. I think he had a good season and a good career himself. Obviously, one of the best. And so Kareem was super dominant until about, and he still was, like I said, till about 1980. But there was a guy that come up, again, kind of sprinkling players that maybe had like one season where they were the most dominant player or most dominant center in the league, was Bill Walton. He come in, and he wasn't necessarily the most dominant. I think it was still Kareem, but Bill was really good, and he won MVP actually in 1978. And Bob McAdoo, he had an MVP in there, and he was technically a center. But still, it was Kareem that was the most dominant center as far as I'm concerned in the 70s. And then later in the 70s, a young guy come out of high school, actually played a year in the ABA, I think with the Spirit of St. Louis. He come in named Moses Malone. And he was kind of the guy that he took the throne, if you want to call it that, from the most dominant center in the league. He took it from Kareem, because by 1980 it was Moses's NBA at that point, and he's a guy that most players, or excuse me, not most fans, at least a lot of younger fans, may not be that aware of him. They may have heard of him, but to have won 3 MVP awards is like very few players have done that, if you think about it. And he's one of them, and he was good. He played with the Houston Rockets and then the Philadelphia 76ers. That was his best years. He played with some other teams later in his career. He was still pretty good with the Bullets, and then even Atlanta, he was still a good player. But as far as his prime goes, he was one of the best ever. And like I said, 3 MVPs, great rebounder, great scorer, probably known as the best offensive rebounder of all time. That's not something that, is like leading the league in scoring, but when you're looking at all the putbacks that he was able to get, that adds up to a lot of points, and he actually averaged up over 30 points a game, at least one season, but a couple of seasons, I do believe. So prime Moses from probably 78, 79 till about 80, I'd say 85 or so. And then there was an emergence of 2 centers, one of which got way better as his career went along, but the other one come in pretty good too, and that was Hakeem Olajuwon and Patrick Ewing. Again, I'll even say Moses was probably the best center until about 87. And then if you look at kind of where Patrick Ewing and Hakeem Olajuwon sort of took off, and it was a no-brainer after that. Moses was getting older too, so there's reasons why, people stop staying as good as they are in their prime. And Hakeem particularly, he really took off later in his career. But the early years, it was Patrick and him, and then David Robinson a couple of years later in 89, 90, somewhere in there. David Robinson come along. And really it was those three guys that were the best, most dominant centers. If I had to pick one, just based on a couple of years later how good he was, would be Olajuwon. But at the time, Olajuwon wasn't who we know him as today. And he wasn't until clear cut the best center till about 93 or so. And even then, David Robinson was really playing well. But if it weren't for those two championships and the way he dominated David Robinson, Shaquille O'Neal, Patrick Ewing, he was the guy. He was the one that dominated the most, at least during that era. So there's kind of a gray area there in the late 80s, early 90s. Who was the best? You could argue any three of those really with Ewing and David Robinson and Olajuwon. So, but clear cut 94 and 95, it's Hakeem Olajuwon by a landslide. He was dominating everyone. He just played his best. He played the best at a skill level, maybe not statistically, like I said with Wilt earlier, but at a skill level, if you look at how well he played in those two seasons with the footwork, the almost perfect games he would have, like the way he would just make these crazy shots, and we'd never seen nothing like that. And he was so quick, and he was so good defensively, and he was a very good rebounder. And to come along and play that well for two straight seasons like that, he definitely gets the nod as the pull-away player between those three as the best center in the league. And then, of course, the big fella, the Diesel, come along in 93, and he kind of took that reign pretty quickly, I would say in 96, the 96 season. As great as Hakeem was in 96, he was still up 27, 28 a game. It was Shaq's world after that, and he just dominated. He dominated for 10 years or more. You know, he was that good. Of course, he played with Orlando early, sent them to the finals in 95 against the Rockets, and of course Olajuwon, that's where he schooled Shaq. And I think they swept them actually in that series. And then he played with the Lakers. O'Neal played with the Lakers after that. And that was definitely his best years. And he was extremely dominant on a statistical level and then on a psychological level. Guys were defeated before they even stepped onto the floor with Shaq at that time. And there was some tough guys back then. Back then you had Alonzo Mourning. Chris Webber was in the league at that time. A lot of big guys that were really tough players and were difficult to intimidate. But Shaq had everyone intimidated except for maybe Dennis Rodman. He was probably the only player that wasn't. And so after that, Shaq kind of slowed down a little bit. And the next great center, and to me, an underrated center, I know a lot of players like to crack on him a lot because Shaq was one to crack on him a lot, is Dwight Howard. He was a great defensive player, great rebounder, great shot blocker, good scorer, kind of in the niche of Bill Russell. Wasn't going to give you 40 a game by any means, but he just did everything pretty well and was super athletic and strong. I'd actually have a video on Dwight Howard. He's not one of my favorite players, but he's kind of one of those enigmas where you wonder, like, what happened to him. He had such potential, and kind of, his career altered with the changes in the NBA and things like that, with a lot of three-point shots. He never was a stretch 5 or 4 or whatever. So his career didn't really evolve in the way it maybe should have. Anyway, check the video out on Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell, and also my Dwight Howard video. Look forward to y'all's comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. You guys have a good weekend, and we'll see you soon.